Chapter 31 Intensive Training Part 2, as if, commented Nairi bitterly in a low voice. Daniel ignored her completely and instead kept eating his meal quietly. He had to go back to the training ground soon, as his spiritual training with the old alchemist was about to start. Training ground. 1,500 hours when Daniel reached the training ground. He noticed the old alchemist sitting quietly on a stone bench. He had his eyes closed, and the only thing that made him look different from a statue was his chest, which inflated and deflated slowly. Many had noticed the old alchemist, but differently from the old master-at-arms. Nobody tried to show off their abilities to him. He was, after all, a spiritual cultivator. Nothing he could teach was of interest to them. The few of them who did approach him did it to convey greetings from their group's leaders and prominent figures. When Daniel approached the old alchemist, the curiosity within the observing group of people grew once more. They were aware of Daniel's talent in martial cultivation and also about his lack of background. They really wanted to know what someone like Daniel could possibly want from a figure like the vice leader of Golden Cauldron. Their questions were answered the very next moment. The old alchemist opened his eyes the moment Daniel came near him. He smiled widely and said, "Ready to start the training?" Sounds of jaws figuratively hitting the ground could be heard in the air. "I am," responded Daniel convincingly. "Will you teach me?" The old alchemist suddenly started to giggle, then said, "Aerial walk, spiritual shield, and mana sensing." He then started to laugh once again. Once more, Daniel had guessed right. It seemed that the master's objective was not only to teach him powerful arts and magics, but also to show him how to defend against the opposite kind of cultivator. For example, the martial arts that the old master-at-arms had decided to teach him were all motion skills that could allow a martial cultivator to approach a mage and engage him in close combat. Similarly, the old alchemist had decided to teach skills that would allow Daniel to avoid close combat and keep himself distant from his enemy. Aerial walk was a skill that allowed a mage to spread his spiritual essence through the air and change its composition in order to allow him to walk on it. This skill required the mastery of wind and water and was considered an extremely advanced skill. Spiritual shield, as the name implied, was a skill that would allow one to create a non-elemental shield made purely of their spiritual essence. The purer the essence and the higher the control, the more resistant the shield. This shield was most useful against magical attacks, but could also be used to strengthen elemental shields and increase their defensive abilities against physical attacks. Lastly, mana sensing was a scouting skill that allowed a mage to sense the changes within the natural mana in a specific area, therefore adding an additional layer of protection against sneak attacks or incoming ranged attacks. "Good, what do we start with?" asked Daniel. The old alchemist got up on his feet and looked at Daniel, then said, "Mana sensing." Mana sensing was a field-type ability, which was similar to the 6th rank of martial cultivation known as surrounding awareness. Both these abilities granted a layer of awareness of one's surroundings, but in different ways. While surrounding awareness was a cultivation stage in which one's senses were so refined that their awareness was heightened to an inhuman level, mana sensing was simply a way of feeling the natural mana in the surroundings and perceive the movements through the changes within it. If one were to compare them, mana sensing would be extremely similar to the yellow-striped Cayman's way of hunting, while the surrounding awareness stage allowed a martial cultivator to hear, smell, and see, making it much more effective than mana sensing. Of course, one was a cultivation stage, while the other was a simple trick among spiritual cultivators. The two methods couldn't be compared. Close your eyes and start to feel the mana. Mana is everywhere, around your body, in the air, inside the plants, into the earth. Feel the mana in the sun rays. Then try to find the abnormalities in the patterns. Explained the old alchemist patiently. Daniel followed the old man's instructions and started to sense the mana in the surroundings. At first, he only felt darkness, but as he managed to connect his spirit with the surrounding mana, he started to feel the solid earth essence under his feet, the feeble essence of the grass, quietly waving above the ground, the rapid wind essence, transported by impetuous gusts of wind. And finally, the still and immovable sun essence, shining over the other types of essence like a gentle mother. Daniel studied their patterns over and over again, trying to get familiar with how they behaved. Then, all of a sudden, a small amount of earth essence started to raise from the ground and merge together, creating a nail-sized mass of earth essence. The earth essence floated quietly until it dashed through the wind essence and went towards Daniel at high speed. Instinctively, Daniel raised his hand and used it to shield himself from the small clamp of earth essence. Thump! A small rock had hit Daniel's palm. Amazing, shouted the old alchemist. One had to know, though in practicing this skill, at first one would only sense shadows of the various essences. The clarity would increase as a mage became more familiar with that specific type of essence, or after raising their rank through spiritual cultivation. What Daniel could see wasn't just shadows. He could differentiate between types of essences and react relatively fast. The old alchemist was expecting that he would have needed to hit Daniel a few times before he would start to find the abnormalities within the essence patterns, but instead, he had felt the incoming stone right away. The more Daniel tried to focus on sensing the various types of essences, the more he became used to them. The ones he made the biggest progresses with were air and earth essences, as he could feel them directly against skin. He then started to feel the old alchemist key, and after pushing himself further in the distance, he felt the key of the practicing cultivators and even the metallic essence of their weapons. For the following 5 hours, the old alchemist kept throwing rocks, curving winds, flattening grass, shielding him from the sun rays, or even digging underground tunnels with thin water snakes. He wanted to help increase Daniel's speed in sensing and reacting to abnormalities. That's what this skill had been invented for. Feeling the mana in one's surrounding was an amazing experience. But if the spiritual cultivator wasn't able to sense the small metal essence which was whizzing towards him at high speed and ended up pierced by an arrow, then he would still be a mage. But a short-lived one. The stages of mana sensing, like spiritual cultivation stages, were divided into faint, moderate, profound, and peak. Daniel's mastery of mana sensing, after 5 hours of uninterrupted training, had reached the moderate sensing. His results in mastering mana sensing, if compared to true motion, have been much more fruitful, and that had been because of the continuous interference of the old alchemist, from whom he received a sort of intensive training. Daniel spent the rest of the day moving while using the advanced notions of true motion and by sensing his surroundings with the spirit. At the end of the day, he had spent almost a fourth of his remaining karma points. He had calculated that within 4 days, he would have run out. So even if he had agreed with the 2 old masters to be mentored for a whole week, he had still decided to attempt a breakthrough to the 4th rank after the 4th day of training. City Lord's Castle. 2,100 hours inside an impressive-looking castle within the Learn District was a large and well-decorated office. Inside this office, refined items of furniture could be seen decorating the room. The most impressive was a 2x1, 5 meters desk built of an antique walnut-colored wood and a flat top made of pearly white marble. Behind this desk, sitting on a wooden throne, was a middle-aged man. This middle-aged man dressed in tidy clothes, which were unable to cover his heavily built and muscular body. His slicked-back, gray hair uncovered a good-looking face, sculpted by strong-mindedness and discipline. "Knock, knock, enter," said the middle-aged man with a low, yet powerful voice. A man in city guard armor with a tiger carved on the left side of his chest entered the door. The man was fully armored, and his face couldn't be seen. In his hand, a long spear was held straight. "City Lord, a communication from the Rioras region governor," said the guard in decisive tone, right before handing an envelope over to the middle-aged man. The city lord took the envelope and opened it, not caring about excusing the guard. The guard didn't dare to move and stood still and wait for orders. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper. Once taken out and unfolded, the city lord read the content of the letter. "The master of the school of Everlasting Fury has requested that you personally welcome his incoming children and convinced the previous Master-at-Arms to take them both in as direct students. Your secondary objective is to discover the reason why the Silver Alchemist has been staying with him for the past 3 days. The City Lord finished reading the letter and then sighed deeply. He had once been a powerful cultivator, and now, after obtaining the position of City Lord, he had been stuck inside this office, only able to come out of his castle to entertain young masters of powerful schools. He picked up the pen from above his desk and started to write a letter. He then folded it, put it inside an envelope, and sealed it with molten wax. He handed it over to the standing guard and said, "Deliver this letter to the old Master-at-Arms." Back to the hotel, Daniel spent his entire evening training true motion and mana sensing without the use of a system. He had decided that he would have spended more points on these two skills, as now that he had learned them, he could increase their mastery later in the future, when he would have had more points to spend. Today, Daniel had trained for 10 hours. Even more if one counted the time he had practiced by himself. Around midnight, he decided to go to sleep in preparation for the next day of training. Next day, training grounds. 8 o'clock like the day before. Daniel found the old Master-at-Arms waiting for him. All around him, a group of young practitioners trained their own skills, trying to impress him. Unfortunately, none of them gained as much as a glimpse from the old man. The moment Daniel approached him, the old man rose up to his feet, and after looking at him for a few seconds, he said, "You have made almost no progression since our training ended yesterday." That was the truth. Daniel had decided to train true motion without the use of the Karmic System, and that had put his learning capabilities below those of a genius. The old man, of course, knew nothing about Daniel's Karmic System or the fact that he had practiced all day. What he knew was that Daniel had prodigy-level talent and that he hadn't made any progress. That had caused him to think of Daniel as lazy and his impression within the old man's mind to lessen a bit. With a slightly disappointed expression, he looked at Daniel and said, "You should put more effort into training." He then turned back into his usual stoic expression and continued today, "He'll teach you Ki Rush." Chapter 32, Intensive Training Part 3 Ki Rush was a martial art created to allow martial cultivators to burst with speed when moving. In order to do that, they needed to force their ki to the bottom of their feet and detonate at the exact moment they dashed towards their enemies. Now, this might sound easy, but it was far from it. A mistake in the control of one's ki during a fight could have pushed the cultivator's body into the area of damage of an enemy mage's spell or even against an enemy martial cultivator's blade. Plus, the burst in speed not only depended by the amount of ki detonated, but also by the quality of the ki, therefore forcing martial cultivator to readapt and learn this skill whenever they advanced in rank. This was the reason why, while this martial art was still classified as a movement art, its most important requirement was a profound control of one's ki. The old Master-at-Arms gave a brief explanation to Daniel, and after just a few minutes, Daniel started to practice it. Daniel channeled his naturally created ki and moved it through his flesh, bones, muscles, and blood vessels. He then focused it on the bottom of his feet and tried to place himself in a dashing position. But the moment his feet touched the ground, he lost control of it, making him jump in the air for 5 meters and fall back down against a stone bench, breaking it in half. Daniel's control of his ki was the worst the old Master-at-Arms had ever seen. And there was a reason for that. Normal cultivators would spend, through their lives, months, if not years, simply training in the control of their ki. Differently, Daniel had never practiced control over his ki, as the system's feature simply helped him in learning things faster. So even if he was capable of focusing his ki into a thin line, right at the edge of his sword, other types of control were new to him. It took a full hour before Daniel could learn how to keep focus on his ki and detonate it at the right moment. After Daniel reached that point, the old Master-at-Arms suddenly picked 5 people from the crowd. The surrounding cultivators' backs straightened like spears. They had heard the old man's word clearly. They all looked at Daniel with hopeful eyes, and the moment his eyes moved past them, their expressions changed into anger or disappointment. Daniel knew already who he wanted to pick. He quickly found his sister's friends within the crowd and indicated them one by one. From the crowd, Nilo, Finn, Riri, Miri, and a random person came out. Daniel knew that the old man wouldn't simply use these people to train him and would reward them later, so he decided to pick a person with good karma as the fifth. The old master-at-arms didn't care which people Daniel picked. He simply turned toward the five and said, "Pick up wooden weapons and take your stances. When you see him dash towards you, attack." Amongst the five of them, everyone but Nilo went towards the weapon racks and picked up their respective weapon. Finn picked a thin, sword-like weapon, while the two sisters picked up two different size battle fans. The remaining of the five picked a thin rod. The old man didn't mind that Nilo hadn't picked a weapon, as he had rewarded Nilo with a tutored session in the past and was aware that he was a hand-to-hand martial artist. The five took their places around Daniel and assumed their battle stances. Daniel didn't waste time and started to use Ki Rush to approach the five. For the first 10 minutes, all Daniel did was getting bashed left and right. There were no serious damages to his body, but he was covered in red marks. The surrounding crowd was enjoying the scene, maybe a little too much. But the more time passed, the less they laughed. The five's attack started to miss, either because Daniel was out of reach or because he had already dashed past them. To make a comparison, during the first 10 minutes of training, he had been hit more than 60 times, while during the following 20 minutes, he had been hit less than 20 times. Daniel's starting point was that of a talentless unranked, and yet his progress defied all logic. After another full hour passed, in which Daniel hadn't been hit even once, the old man stopped the training session by simply saying that's enough. He then approached the five, and while looking at them one by one, he said, "You hold back your attacks, even when you practice. Remember that martial arts are for killing, not for show." He said to Nilo, then looked at Finn, Riri, and Miri, and continued, when you attack, you give up control over the ki inside your rapier. Don't just push ki into it. Condense it. Use a smaller fan. An iron-ribbed one is too heavy for you. I don't know why you're so angry, but keep your emotions in check when you fight. What's the point of hitting hard if you miss? And the crowd felt envy towards this small group of people, and yet they also felt relieved. Many of them had started to believe that not only the old man had no interest in teaching them, but he also didn't pay any attention to their practice. Now, listening to the words of the old man, they had understood that even if he didn't look at them, he still noticed their practice and already had a clear idea of their major defects. The training of Ki Rush was divided into 3 parts: control over ki, precision over long-range bursts, and finally, a mix of the two, precision over short-range bursts. Precision over short-range bursts might simply sound the opposite of precision over long-range bursts, but the difference in difficulty was abysmal. In comparison, long-range burst was like diving with your whole body, while short-range bursts required more control over your ki and was more like jumping and landing over a specific point. Daniel's training ground for short-range burst practice was within the agility and balance section. Inside the agility and balance section of the training ground was a forest made out of differently sized poles pierced into the ground. The distance between one rod and the other varied. Some were 2 meters away, some just enough for a person to pass through. Daniel's objective was to spend 10 minutes inside this forest without hitting any of the poles. That was easier said than done. While training with his time is precious activated, it still took him the remaining 2.5 hours to barely manage to complete the assignment. This had concluded his daily 5 hours of martial training and also concluded his basic training in Ki Rush, as his mastery of it had reached the initial success. The old man had picked martial arts that would take Daniel around 2 days to reach the initial success of. But weirdly enough, something had changed in Daniel since he had been back from his hunting trip, and his learning talent seemed to have doubled. Once concluded the martial training, Daniel went to see Maya and his sister for lunch, then headed back to the training ground for his spiritual training. Like the day before, the old alchemist was waiting for him while sitting on the stone bench with his eyes closed. "I hope you're not too tired from your martial training. This will be plenty tiring by itself," he said to Daniel while slowly opening his eyes. The magical skill that the old alchemist intended on teaching Daniel was spiritual shield. Spiritual shield, as you might have guessed, is a defensive skill made out of pure spiritual essence. The spiritual essence that your spirit receives in exchange for your key is marked, and therefore cannot be controlled by other practitioner unless they are much stronger than you. This mark is not only applied to the spells we cast, but also to the surrounding mana you try to control. In fact, without noticing, whenever you assume control of the surrounding mana, you automatically mark it under your domain. He stopped for a second, letting the information sink into Daniel's mind, then continued. Spells or mana marked by different spiritual practitioners repel each other. And here is how spiritual shield works. Now, force your spiritual essence around your body and shield these magical attacks. For the following 5 hours, Daniel kept focusing his spiritual essence into thin films around his body. One after the other, he shielded himself from the various weak magical attacks the old alchemist kept sending against him, helping its control over the skill to slowly increase. The old alchemist, on the other hand, kept on gradually increasing the strength of the magical attacks, to a point where Daniel was forced to recreate it after each attack. That was the fastest way for someone to learn how to use spiritual shield. Not simply shielding from attacks, but also repairing, recreating, and controlling the amount of spiritual essence within the shield. Meanwhile, inside the old Master-at-Arms' private room, at the table where him and the old alchemist usually sat, a middle-aged man was now sitting, facing him. "It's an honor to meet you again," Master Kai said, the middle-aged man politely. The old Master-at-Arms, whose surname was Kai, looked back at the middle-aged man and answered, "City Lord, to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" "Work," he responded, then took a sip of the tea the old man had offered him, and continued. Master Kai, "Today, the students of the School of Everlasting Fury will arrive, and amongst them, the Master's 3 children. Their father has requested me to ensure them the proper lodging within your building." The brows on the old man's face furrowed deeply. He had a deep grudge against the master of the School of Everlasting Fury, as he was the man who had accused one of his disciples of betraying Carolus. As part of the royal house, the old man wasn't allowed to defend his disappeared disciple, nor save his family from being eradicated when the rumor of his betrayal spread through the population of the kingdom. The master of the School of Everlasting Fury had been the cause of one of his life's biggest regrets. What was worse was that the only children of his disciple was currently dwelling inside his building. If he were to refuse entry to the disciples of the School of Everlasting Fury, their master might become suspicious about the reason, and after investigating further, he might discover Maya amongst the old man's guests. "Of course, I still have plenty of rooms," said the old man after assuming his usual composed expression. "Splendid," exclaimed the city lord before, continuing with a slightly embarrassed tone. "Master Kai, there's another matter I wish to discuss." The old man looked back at him and responded, "Do ask then." The governor was really surprised about learning that the silver alchemist was staying here. He wanted to know if the two of you would have honored the Rioras region by jointly opening a school in one of the cities. Asked the city lord with a curious and confused tone. The old man smiled and responded, "Nothing like that. We've simply found a good seed whom we are competing for." The old man didn't really want to explain himself, but since sooner or later the young men and women within his building would have reported of the two masters' unusual interest towards Daniel, he decided not to keep it secret. The city lord's eyes opened wide in surprise. The old Master-at-Arms and the old alchemist were both prominent figures within the kingdom. Both of them were people whose sex leaders would request to educate their disciples. For both of them to compete for a young man, that was unheard of. Chapter 33 School of Everlasting Fury. Once the surprise on the city lord's face faded, an uncomfortable expression appeared on his face. The task of convincing a man to take the children of his enemy as students was an awful one. It took a moment for him to muster the courage and say, "Master Kai, I have heard from many within the city that." He paused slightly before continuing with embarrassment growing in his voice, "You haven't taken any student yet." "Well, except for that young man you mentioned. The fact is the master of the school of everlasting fury asked the governor to put a good word with you into accepting the young masters as direct students. Would it be possible? A faint smirk grew on the face of the old master-at-arms. He then put his empty cup on the small table and said, "Well, look back at the city lord. There has been a misunderstanding. I haven't started a school. What I own is a building. I've taken all these brats in just to keep me company." His voice suddenly turned serious and continued, "They are free to come live here as tenants. But like any other here, I won't take them as students unless I want to. Master, I feel extremely uncomfortable by doing this, but the governor asked me to remind you about your duty towards the direct disciples of the major sects in SC." His sentence was abruptly interrupted by the old master-at-arms voice. "I am not the master-at-arms anymore. I won't pass down any skill that I don't want to. So there is no need to worry about me," said the old man. "If they want to learn martial skills, they can go to the current master-at-arms." The city lord nodded his head in accordance. Then with a matter-of-fact tone, he added, "Between us, Master Kai, we all know what skill the School of Everlasting Fury wants from you, and the new master-at-arms cannot teach it to them." The corner of the old man's mouth lowered in anger. He wasn't angry at the city lord, as he had simply said the truth. Who he was angry to was the master of the School of Everlasting Fury. One had to know that, in the past, both Mies Fatherder and the master, at the time disciple of the School of Everlasting Fury, were in competition to become the next student of the Master-at-Arms. In the end, Mies' father had been chosen. That had started the hate between the master of the School of Everlasting Fury and the master of the Rulin family, which, after the disappearance of their master, had culminated in the extermination of the Rulin family. The old master-at-arms regained his calm attitude after a few moments, then said, "I have no obligations to teach that skill to them. I wasn't the master-at-arms when the 13th master of the School of Everlasting Fury passed it to me. That skill is mine to pass down to whoever I wish, and my choice doesn't reside within the new generations of that school." His tone serious and determined. "I understand," said the city lord. He then got back on his feet, and after a deep bow towards the old man, he bid farewell and left. Streets of Fury, Commoners Section. 2212 Daniel, Maya, Rayla, and the rest were walking back from the restaurant they had just eaten to. Miri and Riri were walking behind and seemed to be talking with each other. Miri looked embarrassed, while Riri seemed to be convincing her to do something. Nilo and Finn were joking around with the extroverted Rayla, while Daniel and Maya were walking quietly in the front. The streets they were walking into was full of life, and many stalls were placed one next to the other in the lively street. Suddenly, shouting sounds, along with noise of wooden furniture being destroyed, could be heard coming from a place not too far away from them. The noises came from the direction they were going, so they decided to take a look of what was happening. As they arrived, they saw a small crowd spectating a scene in circle. Everyone in the crowd was either chattering in a low voice or shouting in a horrified manner. Daniel and Finn were the first to push their way through the large amount of people, and when they saw what was happening, blood started boiling in their veins. At the entrance of a restaurant, a group of people wearing the same type of martial attire was occupying 3 different tables. 2 tables had 5 people each, while the third only had 2 young men and a young woman. These last 3 people wore clothes of the same style, but their attire was much more refined when compared to the others. On each of these people's tight-fitting clothes, a symbol appeared evidently. It was a red closed fist surrounded by a yellow sun. The table occupied by the better-dressed martial artists had a flipped bowl on it, and soup was dripping down the edge of the table. 2 of the lower-level martial artists were standing near the tables, and at their feet was a young girl which didn't seem to be older than 12 years old. Near her, her mother was begging for forgiveness, while covering her daughter's body with her own. Her daughter's screams were the ones that had attracted Daniel and the rest. Daniel and Finn had immediately noticed the copious amounts of blood on the ground, and when they looked at the young girl, they noticed something that made their faces contort in anger. On the ground, next to the little girl, a pale small hand rested on the ground within a small pool of blood and separated from the rest of her thin and pale arm. The voice of one of the martial artists resounded in the air, "What are you begging for?" I want killer. I just want to take the other hand. He then pushed the little girl's mother away. Primary quest started. Just a wandering hero. Description: save those in need. Third objective set: save the little girl and her mother from certain death. Optional: use one of the group's healing pills to restore the little girl's hand. Optional: exterminate the group of cultivators. Reward: Karma plus 500, plus 500, plus 25,000 / School of Everlasting Fury minus 75%. Time limit: 1 minute, 30 seconds. With an extremely small amount of time to act, Daniel looked at Finn and asked, what does a healing pill look like? Finn was too furious to respond, but fortunately, Nilo wasn't. The size of a pearl, white, slightly transparent. No shine, don't move from here, all of you, Daniel said, before taking a dashing position and bursting towards the martial artist, which was about to punch a hole through the little girl's body. The young man didn't hold back any of his strength. In fact, he put so much force into the punch that his shoulder kept going even after his entire arm was cut clean off his shoulder. The young man didn't even have the time to shout as a strong hand grabbed the back of his neck with a steel grip, and a kick on the back of his knee forced him on his to kneel. Daniel had planned to demand a healing pill from one of the better-dressed martial artists, so he couldn't afford not to appear serious. On his face, a thin stone mask hid his identity. The rest of the group's attention had been caught. With immovable eyes, Daniel looked at the one of the three with slightly dirty clothes and said, healing pill. Now, the one with the dirty clothes sprung up on his feet. Fury filled his eyes. He was about to attack, but as the girl cleared her throat, he calmed down immediately. The girl looked at Daniel, and with a smile on her face, she said, we don't have healing P. But before she could finish, Daniel's hand, which was still holding his bloody sword, moved once more. This time, the right ear of the young man had fallen off. Healing pill, Daniel repeated. The smile on the girl's face disappeared. She then said, you're making a mistake. Even if once again, Daniel's hand moved, and the young man's remaining hand fell on the ground with a slow thud. You are 13. Taking into account arms and ears, I count 52 chances to change your answer into a yes. And if not, it'll start killing. A pearl-sized white pill suddenly approached Daniel at high speed. He released the young man's neck just in time to catch the pill in midair, and the moment he did, the young man's screams started to resound in a deafening volume. Daniel inspected the pill, and after confirming that it was, in fact, as Nilo had described, he walked towards the little girl and gave it to her. He then picked her little hand up and moved it close to her injured arm. Not any random healing pill was able to reattach a limb, but since the system had told Daniel that the one in the group's possession would have been able to restore the little girl's arm, then he knew that this one was. The cells within the girl's arm started to regenerate thanks to the healing essence within the pill. The healing essence moved through the little girl's blood vessels, and when it reached her wrist, it jumped out of her arm and went straight towards her hand. It then seeped into the injured part of the hand and pulled the severed hand back towards it. The whole scene was unreal. It looked like someone was using a white thread to reattach the girl's arm to her hand. The grievous cries of the injured young man were cut off the moment he himself ingested 2 healing pills. Like the little girl, white essence started to reconnect his limbs and ear. The third and last well-dressed martial artist, which was the one who had thrown the healing pill to Daniel, stood up on his feet and simply ordered to the rest, let's go. With no intention of disobeying, every one of them, including the injured young man whose body parts were still only half reattached, followed him quietly. The girl took a good look at Daniel, then turning around and left with the rest. Daniel had no intention of allowing anyone within the crowd to see him reunite with his sister and friends, so he made his way through the crowd and left by himself. Nilo and Finn immediately picked up on Daniel's action and took the others with them before leaving. Amongst the group, excitement, pride, shock, and admiration could be seen in all of their eyes, except for Maya, whose face was contorted in fear and anxiousness as she was on the verge of crying. Luckily, thanks to the collective state of mind of the rest of the group, her expression had managed to go unnoticed until the moment she calmed herself down. It was right after she calmed herself that Daniel, now devoid of his stone mask, approached them from behind and joined the rest of the group as if nothing had happened. Before anyone could say anything, a sound series of slaps landed heavily against Daniel's arm. "You idiot! What the hell were you thinking? Didn't you see how many of them there were?" Rayla shouted while hitting him repeatedly. Daniel tried to parry a few of his sister's hits, but he still let most of them hit him. He knew that his sister was worried sick, and she needed a way to vent her anxiousness. Just as the 30th slap fell heavily on Daniel's shoulder, a small window appeared within his mind, reminding him of the completed objective. Just a wandering hero third objective completed. Reward: 1,000 karma points. Chapter 34 Shadow Approach. On their way back home, Nilo approached Daniel quietly and said, "Thanks." Daniel didn't look back at him, and instead, he said, "No idea what you're talking about. For preventing Finn from doing." He paused for a little bit, then added, "Something stupid." At first, Nilo wasn't sure why Daniel had told him to stay back, but when he saw a mask covering his face, he understood immediately. Daniel knew that if someone could afford to behave like that group did, they would probably belong to a vicious and powerful group. And therefore, letting Nilo, Finn, or the two sisters act might have formed a grudge between their powers and the school of everlasting fury. That didn't mean that if Daniel hadn't told them to stay put, they would have acted. The only person Daniel was convinced would have acted was Finn. Nilo objectively looked at things, and Daniel wasn't sure that he would have chosen to put his friends and school in danger, just to save a little girl and her mother. That might sound a bit cynical, but in a world dominated by power, betting the future of the people who took care of you just to play hero was a dangerous thing. Finn was much more of a reckless person, but even he, after all that had happened, and after he had managed to calm himself down, realized how much he would have risked if Daniel hadn't stopped him from acting. Maybe he would have jumped in and killed one or more of those martial artists, causing their backing power to retaliate against his sect by killing every disciple or member of their families. That was the reason why many young talents who came from powerful schools, sects, and families decided to unconsciously shut down sympathy and assume arrogant and elitist behaviors instead. An example of these types of people was Miri. She wasn't a bad person, but because of the cynical views she was forced to adapt to in order to survive in this world, she had no choice but to separate herself from a world of needy people, which she couldn't afford to help. A view that most young cultivators had to agree to at some point in their life was that it is much easier to act as a bad person than suffer the consequences of being a good one. Naturally, Daniel didn't have a clear picture of the characters of his sister's new friends. The reason why he told them to stay back was that he didn't want to implicate his sister. That's why he had left the scene alone and had worn a mask the whole time. Saving the others some trouble was simply a consequence, although he now had a better opinion of a few of them. After all, in a world where acting had drastic consequences, intentions had a whole different meaning. The second, and probably just as important, reason for preventing them from acting was the fact that he remembered the name of the school from which those martial artists came. He had recognized at the very moment he read the optional reward for exterminating them, which was gaining a bad reputation with the school of everlasting fury. That was the same school whose master had accused Mi's father of treason and caused her entire family to be wiped out. After changing his clothes, Daniel and the rest of the group went back to the old man's building. The little episode had granted Daniel a few more, very much needed, karma points. With them, he had decided to finish his training within the next day and attempt to break through to the 4th rank that night. Unfortunately, when the next morning Daniel went to the training grounds, he didn't find the old master-at-arms waiting for him. He decided to head over to the old man's room to see if he was there. Knock, knock. Daniel knocked on the door twice, then heard a familiar voice coming from the other side. "Come in." He then entered. What he found inside the large room was at least 40 young men and women. They were all quietly standing right next to the table where the old man, along with the old alchemist, were sitting. These 40 young cultivators were divided into a dozen smaller groups. Each of these groups had different attire. Some groups wore heavy armor and had halberds, swords, and even shields strapped to their backs or by their waists. Some others wore lighter armors and carried bows and arrows, short swords, and daggers, and a few carried no weapons at all. All of these small groups of cultivators belonged to a major school of martial arts, sect, or family within the Careless Kingdom. Daniel immediately recognized three of these people. On their back, a red fist surrounded by a bright yellow sun was neatly sewn. They were the three best-dressed members of the school of Everlasting Fury. The young man with the dirted clothes, the girl he had talked to, and the third who had thrown the healing pill at him. "Oh, Daniel, come here," said the old master-at-arms while waving his hand at Daniel. Daniel walked past the large groups of young masters and mistresses and approached the old man. The old man looked at him and said, "I have to welcome these young masters and mistresses today. I won't be able to teach you personally. Here is the complete manual of shadow approach. Practice it by yourself and show me the results later today." The moment the word shadow approach left the old man's mouth, everyone present who carried a bow, daggers, or short swords looked at Daniel with eyes filled with greed. Each of these small groups belonged to powers that had tasked them to inherit specific arts from the old master-at-arms. And for the parties that practiced assassination, shadow approach was one of those. The power that created the shadow approach was a sect called the Quiet Steps sect, and it specialized in assassination techniques. This sect was said to have found its demise due to the assassination of the descendant of an unknown powerful cultivator. And while this rumor hadn't been confirmed, the entire sect had been wiped out in the middle of the night. The only survivor was an elder who, due to his luck, was far from the sect's territory at the time. This elder had escaped to the capital, and after meeting with the king, unsure of his chances of survival, he decided to pass down his sect's arts to the master-at-arms of the time, Master Kai's predecessor, who then passed down the arts to Master Kai himself. That had been the right decision, as the surviving elder of the Quiet Steps sect disappeared just weeks after reaching the capital. The old man noticed the greedy looks on the faces of the present, and after turning to face Daniel once more, he added, "After you memorize the art, burn the book." A similar recommendation had been expected by the crowd of cultivators, whose greedy looks disappeared and were replaced by their usual apparent calm state. Daniel walked towards the door, but as he was about to leave, the voice of the old alchemist resounded in the room. It said, "We'll be seeing you later this evening." The various boys and girls present started to wonder who the hell this brat was and why he was being tutored by two of the most well-known teachers within the Careless Kingdom. One had to know that the two of them weren't amongst the most powerful cultivators of the kingdom, as their cultivation strength was only at the 7th rank. The real reason why they were so deeply known and respected was the vast knowledge they possessed. That was also why many powerful groups sent their young martial artists and mages to learn under the two men's wings. They would then come back and become powerful cultivators under their powers, arts, and guidance. The Careless Kingdom had just come out of a devastating war, which had killed many of their powerful cultivators. The strongest cultivators within the kingdom were no more than 5 rank 9 cultivators, and fewer than 20 who had reached the 8th rank. All small groups inside the old man's private room belonged to a major family, school of martial arts, or sect, and each of these powers had at least a rank 8 amongst their members. For example, the School of Everlasting Fury not only had a master who was close to reaching the 8th rank, but also had a living ancestor who had already reached that level and had acted as the previous master before his retirement. Daniel nodded at the old alchemist and left the room. He went back to the training ground, sat on a stone bench, and started to quietly read the manual of shadow approach. Shadow approach was essentially the opposite of ki rush. Its main purpose was to deaden one's steps through an equal and opposite exertion of ki. The difficult part was to calculate the right amount of ki needed to cushion every single step, as every small difference within one's weight would change the pressure exerted by their movements and, consequently, change the amount of ki required to dampen the noise completely. This was much easier said than done. In fact, this skill was considered hard to learn even for martial cultivators at the full control sub-rank, who were completely aware of their bodies, along with any variations in the weight they carried. Once completely mastered, shadow approach allowed one to cushion the pressure exerted by their steps to a point where they would be able to step over the tip of a blade of grass without flattening it under their weight. Contrary to what many believed, the art's name hadn't been given thanks to a correlation with shadows or darkness. Instead, it was given by the fact that, once mastered, one would be able to approach their enemies as quietly as their own shadows did. This was by far the most difficult of the martial arts Daniel had ever practiced. After 5 full hours of practice, he had only managed to have the noise he made when walking. Daniel didn't know, but that small progress was beyond what anyone had ever managed. The elder who had passed down the skill to Master Kai's predecessor had taken at least a year to reach the point Daniel had reached in just 5 hours. He still hadn't reached the minor stage, but he wasn't far from it. What Daniel didn't expect was for the small task the old man had given him to uncover a new way to use his system's powers. And that was to memorize. Daniel was very intelligent, but not enough to memorize the entire manual of an advanced martial art in just a few minutes. Since the beginning, he had thought that it would have been better just to burn the book and ask for another copy the next day. But when he tried to memorize just enough to keep practicing for the rest of the day, the lengthy process of memorizing was shortened. The feeling Daniel felt was completely different from when he tried to learn a skill, as that was a matter of correcting his mistakes. He hadn't become smarter, nor had his memory been enhanced. It simply felt like, after a simple read, he had gone through the words over and over again for various hours. In the end, Daniel managed to completely memorize the manual in just 15 minutes, and after that, he created a ball of fire and burned the book into ashes. With the training method of each of the martial arts the old man had taught him in mind, Daniel had finished his martial training. All he needed to do before deciding which path to take was to learn the third spiritual art from the old alchemist, and then make his choice. Before learning spells, Daniel had never considered becoming a spiritual cultivator. But after he had defeated the bandit mage and learned control over elements and summoning spells, his mind had changed. Martial cultivation was his father's choice, and, as much as he liked it, he was still torn between the two paths. After lunch, Daniel went to follow the lesson regarding the third and last spiritual art the old alchemist had decided to teach him. He headed towards a training ground, and as usual, he found the old man sitting on the usual stone bench, waiting for him with his eyes closed. "Ready to walk on air?" asked the old alchemist the moment Daniel approached him. On his face, a big and excited grin. Daniel was pretty enthusiastic about the skill he was about to learn. No matter how mature and intelligent a 14-year-old kid could be, they would still be a teenager, and teenagers dreamt of heroics and adventures. Aerial walking is a mixed elemental spiritual art, so to learn it, you'll have to get accustomed to the two elements of which air is formed, specifically water and wind, said the old alchemist. Out of the blue, in his hands, 2 fist-sized beads appeared. The moment these 2 beads appeared, Daniel felt as if he had been transported in the middle of a storm. These 2 beads were of the same size, but the feeling they gave was extremely different. The first thing Daniel noticed was how massive and dense the elemental essence these 2 spheres emitted. One was completely transparent, and Daniel could feel the strong gusts of wind's essence screaming within and around it. He felt like the old alchemist had a ball-shaped tornado in his hand. The second bead was similar, but instead of impetuous and rageful, it emitted calm and quiet waves of water essence. Just by looking at it, Daniel felt as if he was in the middle of a tranquil lake. The bead's color was light blue, with a darker color in the middle, and it looked like a miniature aquatic planet. What was most interesting was that the parts of the spheres that were closest to the other were slowly starting to mutate. Within the clear sky blue bead, the essence started to stir, making the calmness of the water essence turn into restless and devastating waves. It felt as if a storm had started to form within the sea, and immense waves were replacing the previous gentle movement of the water. On the other hand, the part of the transparent sphere closest to the sky blue sphere had started to become misty, and strong conflicting winds started to create hurricanes within its surface. These are elemental spheres. They are created by forcing a specific elemental essence into the shape of a sphere, then condensing it. Of course, to prevent the elemental essence from dispersing the very moment you give up control over it, you need a bounding item. Usually, the best choice is an elemental treasure. The nature of the elemental item would bind the essence and then make it self-sufficient, explained the old alchemist all at once. He paused for a minute to let the information sink in, then continued. As you might have noticed, these two spheres have different effects on each other. This is called the mixing factor, and it's very useful for a mage to learn how to mix elements. That was an important part of becoming a powerful mage. In order for a spiritual cultivator to truly understand the nature of the elements, they needed to see every form of that element. For example, the calm and still waters of a lake, the crashing waves of an ocean during a storm, the slow and misty clouds in the sky, and even solid ice and hot vapor. These were all just as important for one to truly understand water essence. Therefore, in order to truly understand an element, the intervention of a second element was required. Like wind was needed to understand the unstoppable motion of waves, or like fire was needed to understand water's vaporous state. There were a great number of combinations amongst the elements, and that had made mastering even a single one very difficult. Not many spiritual cultivators could claim to have achieved that. The waters and winds elemental spheres that the old alchemist had taken out would allow Daniel to understand the presence of water within the air and its reaction to winds. As the old alchemist was about to pass the two spheres to Daniel, he gave him an unusually serious look and said, "Don't lose them. My father made them, and I want them back. Plus, each of them costs at least a few 100,000 of these hovels." During the last part of the sentence, he glanced at the building owned by the old master-at-arms. One could understand how expensive these two beads were just from that. If the old master-at-arms had been here, he would have cursed at the old alchemist. Not because of the mockery directed at his building, but because of the cheap shot which lending such a precious and useful item to Daniel to train with was. He would have felt as if he were competing for a kid's affection by offering him stones, while the other offered him candies. It was plain cheating. Amongst the spectating practitioners, only a few could recognize the two beads that the old alchemist had handed over to Daniel, and each of them belonged to one of the major powers which Daniel had seen crowding the old man's room. Amongst them were the other members of the school of everlasting fury. Every single one of these cultivators memorized Daniel's face, and then prepared to report what they had seen to the respective young masters and mistresses with whom they had come here with. That was to be expected, as an elemental sphere created with the elemental comprehension of a rank 9 spiritual cultivator, like the leader of the Golden Cauldron, really had no price. Daniel had learned how to ignore the curious looks of others, so he took the two beads and entered one of the private cultivation rooms. He then sat on the ground, and activated time is precious. There is no need to mention how fast Daniel's understanding of wind and water increased. Not only was his speed hundreds of times faster than a normal spiritual cultivator, but thanks to the dense and pure essence within the beads, Daniel's comprehension of wind and water easily surpassed that of fire and earth in just mere minutes. In 10 minutes, he could create gentle streams of water and faint gusts of wind with his spiritual essence. After an hour, he could merge the particles of water within the air of the room and make them condense into tiny droplets of water. 2 hours in, and he was able to make wind brush right over his skin, separating it completely from his clothes. And finally, after spending 2 more hours observing the changes that one element caused within the other, Daniel was finally able to crystallize water particles into ice and merge raging gusts of wind into small tornadoes. Daniel went back to the old alchemist, and, after handing the spheres back to him, he showed his progress. Above his right hand, invisible particles of water started to merge within the air, becoming bigger and bigger, until they reached the size of drops of water. They then merged once more into a bigger ball of water, which then started to slowly solidify, starting from its core. On his left hand, the sound of whistling winds started to scream in the air. Numerous whiffles started to approach the middle of his palm from various directions, and kept crashing one against the other until they became a miniature tornado which rotated quietly above Daniel's hand. The old alchemist, for once, had been left without words. It took him an entire minute to barely mumble astonishing. He then woke himself out of the shock and said, "Very well now. Aerial walking should be simple for you. Imagine being inside a storm. A large hurricane lifts you from the ground and forces you to helplessly follow the motion of its strong merged winds." After a small pause, he continued, "Now, form a wind strong enough to lift your body up from the ground and manage your balance by thickening the water within the air under your feet." Daniel followed the old alchemist's instructions, and what came out of it? It was a disaster. He wasn't able to correct the strength of the updraft current, and as if that wasn't enough, he hadn't been able to form ice platforms strong enough to hold his weight in the air, especially since his weight kept changing due to the strong winds that kept shifting his balance. At the end of his first attempt, he had only managed to learn how to spin and drop from midair. The increased speed of comprehension granted by his system hadn't been able to help him this time, as it was his method that was wrong. Fortunately, Daniel was very intelligent, and it didn't take long for him to realize his mistake. With messy hair and a little bit of air sickness, he landed on the ground and prepared to make another attempt. When he heard the old man's voice, "You're doing it wrong. There's an easy way to understand how to use the wind, and it's to sim." He was then interrupted by Daniel's voice. "I have to force an even updrafting pressure, the same way water would pressure my body from above if I were underwater," Daniel said. "Yes, exactly," exclaimed the old alchemist, without holding back any of his enthusiasm. Daniel straightened his body and started to push his spiritual essence outside of his body. He formed a column inside, which the essence was even and well distributed. Then he turned it into wind essence and forced it into a rising vertical motion. At first, his clothes started to rise, as if he were hanging by his feet. Then, as he got more used to the method, his body started to fluctuate in the air, gently pushed by the winds. Once steadily floating in the air, Daniel started to push more spiritual essence out from under his feet and turned it into water essence, which slowly condensed into 2 layers of water and then solidified into flat slabs of ice. He still needed a lot of practice in order to fully control the winds so that they wouldn't hinder his steps, but for now, he had succeeded in standing in midair. Clap, 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 a loud clapping sound resounded from behind Daniel. It came from a spectating old alchemist, who once again had been shocked by Daniel's ability to find and adapt to new ways. The old alchemist then turned completely serious, and after he approached Daniel, he said, "You have the intelligence needed to become a great spiritual cultivator. I'll do all I can to convince you that there is no other more appropriate path for you but that." Daniel looked at the old alchemist gratefully. This old man had disrupted his plans of becoming a powerful martial cultivator by showing him the amazing path of magic. He was now confused, and in no way were his ideas clear on which path to take. Nevertheless, he was extremely grateful for the attention and care that the 2 old masters had put into him. For all they had done so far, he would have always remembered both of them as his first teachers. There was nothing else left to say, so Daniel bowed deeply to the old alchemist and left the training ground. His direction was the part of the building in which the cultivation rooms were located. Since that day, Daniel had decided to break through to the 4th rank, no matter what, as he had enough karma points and beast cores. So he entered a private cultivation room and sat on a mattress in the middle of the empty room. He then started to think about all that had happened to him, about what he hoped to achieve in the future, and about what path of cultivation better suited him. Half an hour later, he took the 5th-sized rank 4 beast cores out of his bag and started to cultivate.